The Doctrine of the Sabbath. God alone has the power to sanctify time. Therefore humanity should observe the weekly and annual Sabbaths as sacred time with the obligation to rest from labor and assemble for worship. Moses wrote in Genesis chapter 2, verse 3, "So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." Moses again wrote for the children of Israel in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 32, "Everything that I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it or take away from it." There is clear evidence that God sanctified these days, that he expects Gentiles to observe them, and that they have never been annulled. In Leviticus chapter 23, we read a summary of the feasts of the Lord. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 1, Moses wrote, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, that you shall proclaim as holy convocations. They are my appointed feasts." Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3, 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places. In addition to the weekly Sabbath, the Lord has 7 annual festivals that he wants his people to observe. The first festival is called the Passover. We read in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 4, "These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, the holy convocations which you shall proclaim at the time appointed for them. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is the Lord's Passover." Leviticus chapter 23, verse 6, "And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work, but you shall present a food offering to the Lord for 7 days. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work." The next observance is the Feast of Firstfruits. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 9, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, When you come into the land that I give you, and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the firstfruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, so that you may be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath the priest shall wave it." Now the Feast of Weeks, commonly called Pentecost, in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 15, "You shall count 7 full weeks from the day after the Sabbath. From the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, you shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a grain offering of new grain to the Lord." Verse 17, "You shall bring from your dwelling places 2 loaves of bread to be waved, made of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour, and they shall be baked with leaven, as firstfruits to the Lord." Verse 21, "And you shall make a proclamation on the same day. You shall hold a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. It is a statute forever in all your dwelling places throughout your generations." Now the Feast of Trumpets, in Leviticus 23, verse 23, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you shall observe a day of solemn rest, a memorial proclaimed with blast of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work, and you shall present a food offering to the Lord." Next is the Day of Atonement. In Leviticus 23, verse 26, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Now, on the 10th day of this 7th month is the Day of Atonement. It shall be for you a time of holy convocation, and you shall afflict yourselves, that is, fast, and present a food offering to the Lord. And you shall not do any work on that very day, for it is a day of atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. And the last feast, the Feast of Tabernacles, Leviticus 23, verse 33, And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, On the 15th day of this 7th month, and for 7 days, is the Feast of Tabernacles to the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall hold a holy convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall not do any ordinary work. Continuing in Leviticus 23, verse 40, And you shall take on the first day the fruit of splendid trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. You shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It is a statute forever throughout your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. Moses concludes Leviticus 23 by saying, Thus Moses declared to the people of Israel the appointed feasts of the Lord. Notice, these are not Israel's feasts. These are not the feasts of the Jews. These are the appointed feasts of the Lord. There is clear evidence that God intended Gentiles to observe his festivals. Exodus 12, verse 19, For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a sojourner, that is, a foreigner, or a native of the land. Now the Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16, verse 29, And it shall be a statute to you forever, that in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, you shall afflict yourselves, and shall do no work, either the native or the stranger, the foreigner who sojourns among you. Now the Sabbath day in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 14, But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you, or your son, or your daughter, or your male servant, or your female servant, or your ox, or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner, the foreigner, who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. This point is made again in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Jesus said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was established at creation by God himself, for Adam and Eve and for all of their children. The Sabbath was made for all of humanity, not just for Israel. There are several passages of prophecy that clearly show that the Sabbath and the holy days will be kept during the millennium when Jesus rules upon the earth. Notice in Isaiah chapter 66, verse 23, From new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh will come to worship before me, declares the Lord. Also in Ezekiel chapter 45, beginning in verse 17, It shall be the prince's duty to furnish the burnt offerings, grain offerings, and drink offerings at the feasts, the new moons, and the Sabbaths, all the appointed feasts of the house of Israel. He shall provide the sin offerings, grain offerings, burnt offerings, and peace offerings to make atonement on behalf of the house of Israel. Now in Ezekiel 45, verse 21, In the 1st month, on the 14th day of the month, you shall celebrate the feast of the Passover, and for 7 days unleavened bread shall be eaten. In Ezekiel 45, verse 25, In the 7th month, on the 15th day of the month, and for 7 days of the feast, he shall make the same provision for sin offerings, burnt offerings, and grain offerings, and for the oil. This is referring to the Feast of Tabernacles. Notice also in Zechariah chapter 14, verses 16 and 17, Then the survivors from all the nations that have attacked Jerusalem will go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, and to celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles. Verse 17, if any of the peoples of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord Almighty, they will have no rain. So observance of the Feast of Tabernacles will be mandatory during the Millennium. Clearly, during the Millennium, the feast days are not abolished, they are not done away with. There is clear evidence also that the New Testament church continued to keep the Sabbath and God's festivals. Notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, where Paul wrote to the congregation at Corinth, a congregation that consisted of Jews and Gentiles, "Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ our Passover lamb has been sacrificed." Notice verse 8, "Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." Clearly, the New Testament church was continuing to keep God's holy Sabbaths and festivals. The Bible also mentions the existence of certain secular festivals as national days of celebration for the Jews, but those festivals were never considered to be sacred time. Americans celebrate July 4th and Thanksgiving in a similar fashion. There are two festivals that we will look at. The first is called the Feast of Purim. In Esther chapter 9, verse 20, we read, "And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same year by year." Verse 22, "As the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor." So the Feast of Purim is a national day of thanksgiving that is particular to the Jewish people. The other festival that is mentioned is the Feast of Dedication. We read about this in John chapter 10, verse 22. At that time, the Feast of Dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter. The Feast of Dedication is an annual celebration by the Jews to mark the liberation that they experienced in the 2nd century BC, when they threw off foreign oppression and were able to restore the temple worship system. It is a national day of celebration that is particular to the Jewish people. According to Canon 1246 and 1247 of the Code of Canon Law, the Roman Church has sanctified Sunday and 10 annual or variable holy days of obligation as sacred time by its own authority, which includes the Feast of Mary, otherwise known as New Year's Day, Ascension, the Assumption of Mary, All Saints' Day, commonly called Halloween, the Immaculate Conception, and Christmas. Easter always falls on a Sunday, so it is not considered to be a variable feast. Many countries have moved some of the variable days to Sunday. For example, American Catholics only observe 6 variable festivals. The Roman Church does not have the authority to declare these days to be sacred time in place of God's holy Sabbaths. Many Protestants continue to observe these days based on tradition. Thus, they tacitly recognize Rome's authority over them, deny the principle of sola scriptura, nullify God's law through the traditions of men, and worship God in vain. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. but whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Also in Mark chapter 7, verse 6, and he, Jesus, said to them, Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. In John chapter 4, verse 23, But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. In addition, many of these man-made festivals are based on pagan holy days and rituals that were incorporated into the Roman Church by apostates long after the time of the apostles, and imposed on God's people by the power of the Roman state. Notice what was prophesied in Daniel chapter 7, verse 23. Then he said to me, This fourth beast is the fourth world power that will rule the earth. It will be different from all the others. It will devour the whole world, trampling and crushing everything in its path. Its 10 horns are 10 kings who will rule that empire. Then another king will arise, different from the other 10, who will subdue 3 of them. Students of Bible prophecy know well what this fourth beast is. It is the Roman Empire. Now in Daniel chapter 7, verse 25, he will defy the Most High and oppress the holy people of the Most High. He will try to change their sacred festivals and laws, and they will be placed under his control for a time, times, and half a time. This kind of worship is not appropriate or acceptable to God. Therefore, Christians should proactively abstain from observing these man-made days. Moses wrote in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 29, When the Lord your God cuts off before you the nations whom you go in to dispossess, and you dispossess them and dwell in their land, take care that you be not ensnared to follow them after they have been destroyed before you, and that you do not inquire about their gods, saying, How did these nations serve their gods, that I also may do the same? Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 31, You shall not worship the Lord your God in that way, for every abominable thing that the Lord hates they have done for their gods, for they even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. Everything that I command you, you shall be careful to do. You shall not add to it or take from it. Notice also in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 32, And Jeroboam, a king of Israel, appointed a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and he offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he made. And he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he had made. So Jeroboam established a counterfeit festival, different from the one that God had commanded. Now we read in 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 34, And this thing became sin to the house of Jeroboam, so as to cut it off and to destroy it from the face of the earth. The Sabbath is a sign that identifies God's holy people. This applies to Gentiles as well as Israelites. Similarly, Sunday worship is a sign or mark that identifies Satan's servants, whether they know it or not. Notice what Moses wrote in Exodus chapter 31, verse 12. And the Lord said to Moses, You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, Above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord sanctify you. And Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 12, Moreover, I gave them my Sabbaths as a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. Now, in Isaiah chapter 56 and verse 6, And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and does not profane it, and holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. There can be no partnership between righteousness and lawlessness, no fellowship between light and darkness, no harmony between Christ and the adversary. God's command on this matter is clear. Come out from their midst and be separate.